It's crazy to think we've had this channel for almost 6 months now and still haven't really talked about the Vatic Pro Flash. The time is now. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets and Runners. Throughout this channel's lifespan, we've alluded to the Flash's quality many times, but in terms of actual concrete reviewing, it's kind of stayed this mythical creature on the horizon. For those of you more analytical players, if you watched our review of the V7, you could probably get a pretty good idea as to how the Flash plays, but now we're going to get into a lot more detail as to what makes this paddle so special. Now we are doing a full Vatic Pro thermoformed lineup review today, but we are going to spend more time talking about the Flash and then discussing how the other two kind of stack up compared to it. But as usual, before we go on, remember that any of the paddles we talk about here you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. And please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know down in the comments section what you want me to cover next. But anyways, back to Vatic Pro. What makes their lineup so unique is that they offer 3 thermoform paddles, but in drastically different shapes. That means that they all have the performance benefits of thermoforming, but act on them in different ways. Shape is obviously an extremely important characteristic. It not only has an effect on maneuverability, but also on spin, power, stability, and control. Starting with the Flash, the paddle comes in either a 14 or 16 millimeter thickness, and it has this hybrid shape. Now, before these hybrid shapes started coming out, it was much more common to see a 16-inch standard paddle or a 16.5-inch extended paddle. The V7 is that 16 millimeter thick extended paddle. It also has a slightly longer handle than the Flash and a slightly narrower paddle face. It's also a little bit heavier, coming in at 8.4 ounces with the Flash coming in at 8.2. Then finally, we've got the Alchemy. Now, one look at it and you'll see it's the most unique paddle of the 3 because of this big hole in the paddle face. Now, there is this removable rubber guard outlining the hole, but I really didn't like how the paddle played with it in there, so I actually took it out. The performance characteristics I cover today, we'll be talking about the Alchemy without the guard. The paddle weighs 8.1 ounces without it and 8.4 ounces with it. We'll obviously talk a little bit more about what this big hole does here in a second, but in terms of overall shape, it's actually pretty similar to the V7. It's also extended, it just has a slightly longer handle and then a slightly more rounded off top portion of the head here, with the V7 being a lot more square. Now these are all super unique paddles and honestly 3 of my absolute favorite on the market right now, so I'm very excited to get into it. Let's start with hand speed and maneuverability. I kind of wanted to start here because this is where there are the most obvious differences between these 3 paddles, and their movement characteristics are going to be very important in describing some other playability differences down the line. Now, one of the major reasons for the Flash's popularity is because of this hybrid shape. Before these hybrid shapes started coming out, you kind of had to make a decision between extended paddles and standard paddles and which one of maneuverability and stability you were more okay sacrificing. This hybrid shape and length makes that decision far less consequential because it kind of gives you a perfect mix of the two. The Flash is significantly more maneuverable than either the Alchemy or the V7, which makes it a more competitive paddle for hand battles and just a better paddle overall when points get more random around the court. Now, looking at the Alchemy, you might be thinking to yourself, Luca, there's a whole lot of material missing there. That's got to help make it pretty quick. And to a certain extent, you're right. See what I did there? The hole definitely does help quicken it up, but it's still nowhere near as fast as the Flash. Removing material in the middle of the paddle like this just doesn't have as much of an effect as straight up making the paddle shorter. Here's the thing with the hole though. By removing material in the middle of the paddle, you're concentrating more of the paddle's mass at the poles, which makes the Alchemy swing more like a tennis racket. I know saying a pickleball paddle swings like a tennis racket is a little bit hard to grasp, but that is really what you get here. Now the V7 is extended and actually has a pretty short handle for an extended paddle. That means the paddle face comes down farther, and because this is less aerodynamic than this, it's a pretty slow paddle. In terms of maneuverability, it really can't compete with the Flash, and it's noticeably slower than the Alchemy, but for a lot of people, including myself, that doesn't really matter because what it lacks in quickness, it makes up for in other areas. There's a reason why you'll see a lot of professional pickleball players playing with extended paddles, despite what I just said about them being noticeably slower for hand battles. More length gives you more power, more spin, but more importantly, more stability. Stability is crucial because it's one of the main drivers in determining control. More stability means more consistency, and if you have a more consistent paddle, you'll feel more confident with control. In terms of control from the baseline, the added stability makes the V7 the most controlled of the 3, but while it might technically be lower, that's another area where this hybrid shape really does does help make the Flash shine. I was super hesitant to try the Flash because at the end of the day, it still is a shorter paddle, but in terms of stability, it is much, much closer to an extended paddle than it is a standard one, and that's pretty darn impressive. That's kind of the magic with this hybrid shape. The loss in stability is nowhere near as big as the gain in maneuverability, so there is still a choice to be made, but unless you're a total stability addict, it's not that difficult of a decision. The stability on the Alchemy is good, but not as good as on the other two, and that's again because of the hole. It's not as sturdy on impact, but I actually really like the way this paddle pockets the ball because it is so unique. Instead of the core cushioning the impact, it actually feels like the whole paddle flexes. Now that does make for a slightly more wobbly response off the paddle bed when you're hitting slower pace shots, so control in that sense is lacking, no question. But that unique flexy sensation of feeling the whole paddle bend is very similar to how a tennis racket flexes, which means again, tennis players might really appreciate this on ground strokes. Spin, 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 the #1 buzzword in pickleball right now. If you're looking at thermoformed Vatics, you probably know they're all extremely spin friendly, but which one is the most? Other than maneuverability, this is probably where the Flash shines brightest, not only compared to the V7 and the Alchemy, but also compared to the rest of the industry. It's shorter, so there's less leverage to add spin, fine, but because it is shorter, it's also whippier, so you can accelerate the paddle face through contact very quickly, which is a recipe for more spin. That's great everywhere on the court, ground strokes included, but where it really shines is on spin volleys at the net. I said this in our double black diamond review, and it applies to the Flash too because they're pretty much the same shape, but this paddle is so flickable, so you can pretty much roll any volley. The roll volley is super important in pickleball because that's kind of how you get more penetration on your volleys, so the Flash absolutely excels there. There's not much to say about the V7 other than it's just extremely spin friendly. It's thermoformed and elongated, so tons of leverage over the ball, and one of the best designs for more spin, especially from the baseline. It's not as interesting for spin as the Flash because it does have a more classic shape, but I do think it is just ever so slightly more spin friendly, especially on ground strokes, again because of that extra leverage. Now the hole on the Alchemy does mean that it's not as sturdy on impact as the other two, so it's technically not as spin friendly, but just because it might technically not produce as many RPMs doesn't mean some people might not actually prefer it for spin. It goes back to what I said about this kind of tennis-like swing pattern. I feel most at home with this swing pattern, so it's the paddle I feel the most confidence going for really hard spinny shots with. You might be thinking, Luca, that's just your personal experience, but I can bet a lot of people coming from a tennis background will feel the same way. Now the reason that's important is because if you are a good tennis player, all those years you have been playing tennis, you've basically been learning the proper technique on how to hit with spin. When you add a paddle that works really well for tennis players with tennis players who know how to hit with spin, you get a lot of spin. I'll touch on power really briefly here because otherwise this video is going to be way too long, and honestly it's kind of the least interesting characteristic because they're all thermoformed. As you would expect, they're all very powerful. This is probably where the Flash is the least competitive because you can't really replicate the amount of power you'd get from something extended, but you can always add lead to give it a bit more punch. The V7 is just one of the most powerful 60mm paddles out there, yup. And the Alchemy is noticeably less so, again, because the hole takes away from a bit of that rigidity on contact. I know I'm beginning to sound a bit like a broken record with that, but the hole really is one of the main drivers for most of its playability, so what can you do? Now, who these paddles are good for is interesting, so stick around because I have been kind of trying to tread lightly with the Alchemy because a lot of what I said has been negative, at least when you're directly comparing it to the other two. Here's the thing, if you go back and listen to what I said, a lot of what I say is the Alchemy is technically worse for this, but because of this unique property that it has, it actually might work better for some people. That's important because pickleball is played on court, not in a lab, so it might technically have less of a lot of things, but because the feel is so unique, some people are going to absolutely love it, including myself. If you come from a tennis background and have the opportunity to try it, you should really give it a shot. I'm not saying it's going to work for everyone, but try it out and see what you think because it is very interesting. Now the Flash, on the other hand, will work for pretty much everyone, and you don't really need me to tell you that. Just look at our best-selling video and 6-0 stock problems. The numbers speak for themselves. It's just such a well-rounded paddle that also excels in a lot of categories, and when you're a jack of all trades but also really good at a lot of stuff, that's kind of just a recipe for success. The only people who might not like the Flash are those players who have gotten totally used to the swing characteristics of either a standard or extended length paddle. I'm probably still not ready to switch to it because I am so used to extended paddles. They're kind of like my safety blanket, but I really do want to switch to it because the maneuverability benefits are just incredible. I guess you could say the V7 is the most boring paddle of the three, but it absolutely absolutely does have a place in this lineup. It doesn't have any flashy hole or cool unique hybrid shape. It's just a classic extended paddle that does exactly what you would expect. It's spin friendly, it's powerful, it's stable, and it's very slow. One thing I am kind of sure of though is that one of these paddles will work for pretty much any type of player. If you do want a cheaper alternative to either the V7 or the Flash, there's always the Prism line, but you will absolutely not have the same amount of power and spin. Keep that in mind. For now though, that is going to be the end of the video for today. I know we got pretty technical there, so I hope you liked that. If you do want to demo any of these paddles, you can always come visit us in store, or you can check them out online at racketsandrunners.ca.